All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. A couple more people coming on. Feel free, like I said, feel free to put in the chat where you're coming from. You can see that we're all across our Alliance Northwest family, so that's great. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Julie and I work in the field office. Today we're going to be joined by Troy Gullstrom from our Alliance Northwest family and Phil Lohmeyer from CAMA and from our Greater Alliance family. So thank you for joining us. We have Rachel from our field office who's here helping with the tech as well. So, and just so you know, the webinar will be recorded so we can share this with others in the field and that you can revisit it if you want to check back in and remember what was said. Everyone on the call will be muted, but feel free to communicate via the chat feature. And there will be question and answer time as well that we can answer any questions at the end of the time. So I just wanted to let you know the idea for this training came from our office as a result of the wildfires. And as we were talking about it, we were trying to figure out how can we can help our churches, how our office could help our churches be prepared or start thinking through what they would do when a disaster happens. And one of the ways was just that we were thinking was just to help prepare our churches to just start the process of thinking through what they would do if a disaster hit. So two of the takeaways that I hope you come away from this time is just the benefits of being ready to respond to a disaster and what that does for, as you listen to Phil, you'll hear what that does to draw people into Jesus, both when a disaster happens, but also as you're preparing for the disaster. So that's one thing that I'd love for you to take away, but also just one step to start thinking through the process. Not a overall, we have to, get this all together, but just what's the next steps? What's the first step in doing that? So there'll be a couple polls going on, so feel free to answer the poll as we go through this. And we're just looking forward to hearing more and understanding more where you guys are coming from. Like I said, there will be a question and answer time at the end of Phil's presentation, so feel free to write those in the chat and we'll work through those towards the end. As we get started, let me just pray for our time together. So let's begin. Dear Jesus, thank you for being with us during this time, for being sovereign over all that is happening in our world, in our communities, in our churches, and even in our own lives. Jesus, I just ask for your hand upon our time today, that you would give those here a peaceful heart and guidance as they hear the information presented and seek to lead their churches in disaster preparedness. Jesus, we pray that this wouldn't just be about preparing for disasters, but how we can draw people to you in both the preparation steps as well as if a disaster hits. Thank you for Troy and for Phil, for them being willing to share. We just ask that you be with them as they share. We just thank you for your love. Amen. So next, the first thing we'll do from here is to hear from Troy, who's part of our Alliance Northwest family. And he is from Mehama Community Church in Mehama, Oregon. And he's going to share just a little bit about his journey as he just walked recently through the wildfires for his community. Troy, go ahead.
All right.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Yep, glad to be here. Just a little personal background, just so, some of you know me, but most of you probably don't know me. I've been married 33 years, have 7 children. I have 10 grandchildren plus one was due yesterday, not here yet. Raised all of our children in the Mehama community and at our church here. Volunteer service with the fire department for 24 years. I retired from that about 3 years ago, which means absolutely nothing. I just don't have to respond to the calls is all. Attended Mehama Community Church for 19 years, pastored here for 15 years, been a hospital chaplain for 5 to 7 years. And active in our community. We have a food bank with our church. We have a community center. We do lots of community events with the other churches in town. And I give you all that background to say we've been here for a long time. So in some ways, my position in our community is a little bit unique because we have a lot of longevity here, lots of relationship building. But one of the things as this fire took place, it's overwhelming. If you haven't been through here, if you haven't been through a fire like this, you can't describe it. It's incredible. But one of the things, and I shared this in a video some time ago, I think with Rachel and Dennis, was about a program called Services Integration Team. And this is something I had been praying about for a very long time, but not knowing how to put all the partners together. And Services Integration Team was started about 2 years ago, actually through the San Am Hospital, our local hospital, bringing together all the stakeholders in the community, government agencies, community members, civic groups, and the faith community. I was asked specifically to be on this committee as to help people, to bring all the resources together and be a really help to those, whether it's housing or healthcare or domestic issues or whatever those pieces are. And so we gather around a table. For 2 years, we gathered around a table once a month, and we shared different situations. The services integration person, a coordinator, vetted all these folks that she brought to us. And we were able to leverage dollars that we had access to 5 times. So every dollar that was spent, we pretty much leveraged $4 to $5 to help people. I give you all that background information because this is the template that we're using for the wildfire recovery in our canyon. We formed a group called the San Am Canyon Wildfire Relief Fund Advisory Council. And we have like 3 phases. The initial phase of just immediate needs. We have cleanup, which is phase 2. Phase 3 is the build out, or rebuild actually. Probably 3 to 6 year process, we're figuring. So we use this template, and now we're taking in all these people. We've confirmed 912 households in our canyon who are in need of some sort of assistance. Some of them have lost everything: their house, their outbuildings, their animals, their livelihood. To other people who have lost outbuildings or have smoke damage and that kind of stuff. The beautiful part about this is that we get to come together in our community. And be a blessing. Excuse me. And as we've built relationships in our community, the church is being looked to for help, for encouragement. And we have a diverse group of churches involved, from Catholic churches to Alliance churches to Baptist churches to Assembly of God churches. All the groups are being involved. Some are more active than others. But I think the important thing for all of us to remember is it's easy to go maybe have an attitude of us and them, but it's really just us. We're all sinners saved by grace, right, through faith. And as we just love one another, as we encourage one another, as we make ourselves available and don't keep ourselves inside of our building, we have an impact in our community. And again, I'm coming from a longevity. I have a lot of responsibility in our community. I have a lot of relationships in our community. But I think it's true for all of us, no matter if you just show up today or you've been here for 25 years. You start reaching out to people and you start building that trust, and you'll have a voice to preach the gospel, to speak the gospel. And I have 3 things. I'll wrap up with this. Main things in all of this is showing Christ's compassion for all the hurting and the lost. Exercising that compassion in meeting many different ways. It could just be a source. I have people that drop by gas cards for people up the canyon that have to do extra traveling because of childcare, school, jobs, whatever. And we're giving out gas cards. We've got people that have said, I really can't do anything physically, but I've got money. And so they go buy certificates, gift cards and stuff from businesses to bless the business and to bless the folks who are in need. So there's lots of different ways that we as a church, individuals of those churches in our community can to participate. And I think probably one of the key ones is purposefully partner with existing groups to bless them. Sometimes the church comes in and says, we've got the answers, let us take care of this. See what's already going on and say, how can we help? You know, when our kids, excuse me, were little, the expression we loved to hear was when they'd come into the room, how can I help? I think that's true for any group. When we come and say, how can we help? We'll do whatever you need us to do. What do you need? And I think those are some key things that we need to remember as we prepare for disaster. And we were looking at some disaster plans, not seriously, really, before all this happened, but guess what we're doing now? We're starting to look at some of that stuff and go, how can we be better prepared? And you're never prepared completely. But Julie, you had mentioned one step of being prepared. And we just need to take those steps and just each day take another step and put it together. And Phil, you're going to help us with some of that, what that looks like. I'm sure. And anyway, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you so much for just sharing your heart and your heart for the lost and your community. I really appreciate that. We had one person ask if you just kind of put that mission statement, some of those pieces that you maybe just type those into the chat so people could see that as well. I think
I can do that, yeah.
Yeah, I think what you've just said is just a great building block for what Phil will say. You know, those relationships that you already had started is key, is important. So thank you. I really appreciate that. All right, so now we're going to switch it over to Phil, and who I've just known for a little time, but just as with Troy, he's got a heart for Jesus and for people knowing Jesus. And so I'm excited to hear from him, as well as from the knowledge that he brings. Phil is a disaster response coordinator for CAMA Services and in the Central District for the CMA. He lives in Centerburg, Ohio, and is the chaplain in his local fire department and part of the National Guard. I think I got that all right. Is that right, Phil?
You did. I wear a lot of hats, but that's you covered the bases there. Yes.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Phil, for your time. So I'll just hand it over to you and let you take over with what you have to present.
Great. And I'll try to remember to say good morning or this morning, but it's actually 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in Ohio, but that's great. So thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to come and listen to an old guy from Ohio talk about what's on my heart, and that is how we can show Christ's love to folks in the midst of a disaster. So as I try to share my screen here with me, bear with me, we'll see if we can get this right. Perfect. So I am the U.S. Disaster Response Coordinator for CAMA Services, and CAMA is the Relief and Development arm of the Christian Missionary Alliance, for those of you that aren't familiar with us. And we've done a great job overseas. We're now trying to bring some of those best practices to the States and work within that platform. So again, welcome and thanks for coming with us. I always say that prayer should be our first response and not our last resort, but Julie has done a good job in covering us in prayer this morning. So I won't go through that again, other than maybe at the end we'll pray through that. As CAMA Services, as part of the national office, we kind of look at disaster response through 4 different lenses. First and foremost, it's a Christ-centered compassion. Everything we do ought to be developed with how would Jesus look at these people? How would Jesus, answer these needs? So if Christ is not the center of what we're doing, we might as well not do it. There's no reason to. So we first and foremost, it has to be Christ-centered. Then we look at community development. How do we continue to keep that community thriving? And I think Troy mentioned things as simple as gift cards and sending money to folks. We always have a big heart and everybody wants to send clothes and they want to send stuff to people following a disaster. And if it's stuff that they can't get, that's great. But if the stores and the resources are open in their community, if we can send the financial resources so that they can buy those things in their community to keep that local hardware store up and running, to keep that local franchise up and running, that feeds right into the whole community development part of what we look at. And again, local collaborations. If we're looking at it, everything with a Christ-centered mindset or a kingdom mindset, it doesn't matter whether it's the Baptist church doing it, the Assemblies of God church doing it, or some non-religious nonprofit. If the needs are being met, why shouldn't we come alongside them and just help multiply that? And we'll talk about that. And then we just talk about some best practices and quite frankly, some mistakes that we've seen that have been made and that we try to help learn from our own mistakes. What I want you to think about though is not that the disaster response ministry is this guy or gal in a box that you say, I'll break glass only in case of emergency, right? I know a lot of districts and churches think, well, why would I invest money into a program? Why would I have a person that's just gonna, sit in the corner and wait till a disaster happens? So I want you to think of this as not just a response to when the disaster happens, but this is an ongoing community outreach. So if we think of this as a community outreach ministry that just happens to thrive in the midst of a disaster, I think that might give you a better picture of what we're looking to do here. And I say that so before a disaster strikes, and these are some things that I do here in the Central District, and we're trying to get some training up and running nationally here real soon, but you're doing training, whether that's training at your local church to do first aid and CPR training. You're doing training on, psychological first aid or crisis counseling. Maybe you host a community CERT team. CERT is Community Emergency Response Team, for those of you that aren't familiar with that. So you're doing trainings and getting folks up and running. You're talking to churches about safety and security and those things so that they can continue to be thriving and engaged in their community. You're out building those relationships, right? The first time we meet the fire chief shouldn't be when our building's on fire, right? So we want you to get out there and engage with the police department, the fire department, all the other nonprofits in your community. Troy talked about those relationships and having that. Relationships are kind of the currency of the realm, as they say, right? You have to have those relationships. You have to have that trust built. And it's difficult to build that trust in the midst of chaos. So go out and have a cup of coffee with these folks. Go out, go to their meetings. And I know we all have enough meetings to go to and we have enough things to do, but start building those relationships now so that they can withstand the trials that will come. And then just continue to do community outreach. A lot of you already have, food service, food pantries, or you're providing a meal on a fairly regular basis. You're doing care packages for the homeless, hygiene packages for that. Take those community outreach things that you're already doing, invest just a little bit more into them, and that's disaster response ministry. During the disaster, it's all about meeting the immediate needs. Right then, it's I'm cold, I'm hungry. So how can we meet those needs? Whether it's providing meals, whether it's providing just, we can open up our church and let folks come in and charge their cell phones. We can let them come in and get dried off or warmed up or cooled down or whatever the case may be. So how can we meet those immediate needs? And that's what we're doing in the midst of a disaster. But we're keeping in mind that it is a Christ-centered response. Again, it's all about Jesus, because he's the only answer to all of this mess that we're in anyhow. So again, this disaster coordinator, team of disaster folks are, meeting those immediate needs right away. And then we need to look at the long-term recovery, right? After the fires have come through, after the hurricane has come through, what do we do now? And I certainly don't want to seem negative towards some of our other bigger partners, but you see a lot of, the bigger organizations will come in with their big vans and their trucks. They'll be there for the 2 or 3 weeks and then they leave. Well, the local church is left there. So you as the local church are there now. You'll be there in the midst of the disaster and maybe be affected by it yourself, but then you're also going to be there for the long term in the end. So you are that thread that keeps the community together. So we want you to continue to show Christ's love through the midst of this, even when we ourselves are tired and hungry and wet and whatever, right? We want you to stay engaged in the community. Most communities following a major disaster will have a long-term recovery committee or a group of folks that are getting together to work on those things. Put yourself out there to be a part of that, because we have the answer to the community, and that is through Jesus Christ, right? And then we're there as the church to help heal those emotional needs. And we'll talk about some of those emotional needs that come up following a disaster as well. So I hope you're tracking with me so far. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I think Rachel or somebody will stop me if we need to answer one, but otherwise we'll get them here towards the end. So as we talk about building your team and what does it look like to have a community team, a disaster response team, and we're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about the district disaster response coordinator, because that will come later, and that person may or may not be somebody that's that's on staff and there all the time, but they're kind of just holding things together from a district perspective, because as you've noticed through the wildfires, I was out with Pastor Larry in Medford here a month or so ago, and you've got wildfires here there. So it really is there is a place for the district to be involved, but you're here to learn about what your local church can do. So we'll spend a little more time in that respect. So we have folks that we call the local coordinators or a site coordinator, and they're responsible for representing the local church. They'll work with the district and the other partners just to make sure that those needs aren't being met, because what works in in Medford, Oregon may not work in Columbus, Ohio, right? So you're there to keep tracking. It may not be the same in Alaska. I saw we had somebody on from Alaska here. So again, you're making sure those local connections, those local needs aren't getting missed, right? This person is kind of the guy or gal who is good at doing scheduling, helping to arrange transportation for teams that are coming in, that are staying, housing if it needs to be done, meals for the teams that are coming in, and all of those kind of logistical types of things that need to happen behind the scenes, right? Because you don't want 4 teams there one week and nobody the following week. So you want to make sure you're scheduling folks out in an appropriate manner, making sure that they have a way to get from the airport to the church or where they're being housed, those types of things. So as you look for that person, think somebody that's really good logistically and how they can manage getting those folks around, finding out where the work projects need to happen, those types of things. Then we have folks that we call team leaders. And let's not confuse this with, if I come from Ohio to come out and help you as a work crew, we're going to have a team leader that's going to lead our team there. So think of this as kind of the team leader for the team leaders, if you will. They're part of the local church. They are making sure that the connection between the community and the disaster relief efforts that are happening come back to the local church, right? It doesn't do us any good for them to build a connection with Phil Lohmeyer. We want them to build a connection with Troy, who's there in the local church that's going to continue to be there, right? So this team leader is also going to make sure when the team gets there, they make them feel welcomed. They give them a welcome briefing. They give them the safety briefing of, hey, there's still a curfew going on. So, you need to be aware of this, and just those safety things that they need to be aware of. This person probably has some construction skills or those types of things that can look out for safety issues, because we have a lot of loving Alliance family members who want to come out and help, but have never hit anything with a hammer other than their thumb, right? So we need those folks to help kind of come alongside them and guide them in that realm. You may have to provide transportation to the work sites, or at least a map and lead them to the work site. And then every night, and I can't stress this enough, every night when they get back to the church and they're having their dinner, or they've had dinner and they're back and ready to go, don't just let folks go off and go to their cot or go to their corner of the fellowship hall and jump into their sleeping bag. We need to have this time when we touch base with everybody. We find out, first of all, are there any physical needs? Hey, did you pull a muscle? Did you hit your thumb one too many times? Are there any things that we need to take care of? Because folks don't want to tell us that. So somebody needs to draw that out of them there. And then, are there any issues at home that are distracting you now from being able to really serve and show Christ's love while you're doing this? And then finally, what are some of the mental issues or the emotional needs that you had? Because for a lot of folks that are coming out to get involved in a disaster, they're going to see things, hear things, and smell things that most people should never have to see, hear, or smell, right? So we're going to talk to them about, okay, what did you see today? What did you hear today that was either great or that's really disturbing to you? And I'll give you just a couple of examples real quick. I had two men that I thought, I've worked with before a couple of times, and they came to Houston following the hurricane. And if you remember the pictures from Houston, everybody's life was out in their front yard. I mean, their whole houses were gutted out, and piles of clothing and toys and furnishings were all out in the front yard. And I walked up to the one gentleman, and he's in tears because he's looking at a pile of stuffed animals that just reminded him of his children at home. And he wasn't there to be there with them. I had another gentleman who, there was an old upright piano that was out in the middle of the front yard. And all he could think about was, the only thing I have left of Grandma is her piano. And how would I feel if I lost that piano? So again, it's just helping people to process through that. So this team leader has to have at least a little bit of skills physically in how to do things, or at least how to keep people safe, but really more so keeping an eye out for those cues of when people are starting to go a little bit silent that shouldn't be, or what's going on, so that we can start asking those questions. And I would say this is true even of our folks that are out there now doing food ministries or working with the homeless and doing those things. That can get very taxing on us emotionally. And we need to make sure that we have somebody that's touching base with them and reaching back out to them on a regular basis to make sure that they're okay. Because if we're not healthy, we can't help other people get healthy. And then if you notice here, there's a couple dots and no answers. But what I want you to realize is you will have problems with team dynamics. We are not always going to get along. We're not always going to agree with the way things are going. So as you're building your team and talking through this, you need to talk about how are we going to manage conflicts and anything else that comes. How are we going to manage, the person that says they want to help, but they just never show up? Or how are we going to handle, the person that we know is spending too much time here and needs to spend some time at home? Again, you'll have to answer those with your team and your community, but I put that slide in there just to remind us that we're still going to have those human issues that we always have in dealing with a team. So please keep that in mind as you move forward. The other thing we always say is that we cannot be everything for everybody. I think Troy had mentioned that as part of the team, he's connected with the community. He knows what needs to be done. He's already working with groups to see where the gaps are in the community and the needs that are not being met or aren't being fully met. So as you process through this, continue to look at what do you see as the greatest need in your community today, next week, next month, and next year, because those will change week to week. The first couple weeks, it's immediate needs, food, clothing, shelter. The next few weeks, it might be helping folks to get storage sheds or yard barns onto their property just so that they can secure some of the few things that they have left. The following months, it might be psychological first aid, but continue to process through that and see, what are the gaps in your community? How can you meet those needs and do them well while showing Christ's love? Because if we try to be everything for everybody, we're going to do a bunch of things and do none of them well. And we're just not serving well if we do that. So again, as a church, find one or two things that you can do, that you can continue to do well, that you can sustain, and that you can show Christ's love while you're doing it. So we have found, and hopefully this isn't a surprise to most of you, that people need to be seen and they need to be heard, right? I mean, I think we go out to any street corner today and in any group of people, and the biggest thing we'll see is they just want to be seen and they just want to be heard. And sometimes they just need to tell their story, and we need to allow them the time to do that. I'll give you a good example without getting too lengthy. We had several years ago, we had a flood in West Virginia, which is part of our district. And as we were finishing up, we got to a point where things were getting back together and it was just about time to go to school, for the kids to go back to school, but they were going to different school buildings, or they were going to school in a trailer instead of their school. So for me, I always realized that even though I grew up fairly poor, we always got a new pair of shoes at school time, right? Everybody got some new pairs of shoes. So long story short, we created a shoe drive, drove all over the district, picking up shoes and collecting money and buying shoes. And the thing was going great. We were giving away shoes and people were coming. It worked well. And then we noticed there was a lady that was there with her grandchildren to get shoes. And she kept walking around and she was looking at things, and we're like, well, do you need some shoes too? No, I just want to take care of my kids, my grandkids. Well, we have plenty of shoes. If there's something that fits you and you want them, please do that. And she finally goes over and she finds a pair of black New Balance shoes that were not fancy looking at all, that an old guy like me would wear, but they were their ladies, and they happened to be in her size. And she just broke down in tears. Because what she hadn't told us was she worked at a restaurant that required them to wear those same non-slip black shoes. And she couldn't go back to work because she couldn't afford to go out and buy that pair of shoes. So just listening to that story, and I try not to cry when I get into that, taking the time to listen to her made a world of difference and got her back to work. So it made her feel important again and made her be able to be a part of her community again. So again, take time and listen to people and let them tell their story. The other side of that is after a disaster, psychologically, it's been proven that people just need to tell their story. If they've told their story 3 or 4 times, that story no longer has control of them. They're able to get that out and realize that, yes, this terrible thing happened, but I'm still here. And then they start asking the question, well, why am I here? Which opens the door to us to start sharing Jesus with them. But again, if they tell that story, the story no longer has control of them. If they keep it bottled up inside, it eats away at them, right? We've all been there. Then we have a concept that we have found it works really well. We kind of did this in Houston. They call it #house. I'm old enough that I would still call this a pound sign. But if we look at your house is in the middle of the pound sign there, or the hashtag, do you know your neighbors, right? Who are the neighbors across the street from you, next door to you, that live behind you? Depending on which side of the creek or creek you live on, you can say, do they live kitty corner or catty corner from you, right? So do we know our neighbors? And do we know what their needs are? Right now, we're all talking, we were talking before we got on here about we're getting ready to lock back down again, a lot of us, right? So what are some things that we can do to meet some of the immediate needs of these neighbors? You know, maybe we've got an elderly couple that lives next to us that are just afraid to go out and get their medicine. If we could go out and help them do that and meet that need for them now, when a disaster comes, we're better prepared to do that. So some of us in the Alliance, we call this missional living, right? We ought to be doing this every day anyhow, getting to know our neighbors and do that. How this worked in Houston, and a lot of folks think, you know, when the disaster strikes, we want to come out and we want to help poor people, we want to help the lost, and that's true. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with saying we want to help members of our own church too. We want to help our Alliance brothers and sisters. So in this case, we reached out to Kim Thompson, who lived in the house in the middle of the hashtag there, and we started working with her. She was part of the Greenhouse Alliance Church in Katy, Texas. And as we started talking to her, we started asking her about her neighbors. And she, oh, this neighbor over here doesn't have much family. This neighbor here, this. So we start reaching out to them. And what you'll find is some of them will say, you know what, I have really great insurance, thank you, but we're good. You know, others will tell you, I don't want anything to do with you and your Jesus, just get on out to the curb. And that's okay too. We'll continue to pray for them and move forward with that. But through this process, we were able to help at least 3 that I know of, 3 of Kim Thompson's neighbors, who then went out and started helping their neighbors, and it just continued to grow from there. Then we went to the next Alliance members family in the same process. And not that it's about growing numbers in the church, but it's about bringing people in touch with Jesus. So through this process, in the last 2 years since the hurricane and continuing to do this #house, they have added 200 new believers to their church. And that's more important than people that just come and sit in a seat, right? We want them to truly have that connection with Jesus. So that's how we ought to be talking to our folks about that regularly. How do we live missionally in our own communities? If you look at the CERT team and other things that help out in the community, that's what they tell you is help yourself and your immediate neighbors for that first 3 to 5 days before help gets there. So now let's make this our church in the middle of this hashtag. Has your church reached out to your neighbors? Are we reaching out to the Baptist church? Are we reaching out to the Catholic church? Are we reaching out to the Red Cross, the other food banks or organizations that are doing great things in our community? And how can we partner with them? Or at least how do we know, what their needs are and how we can help them and how they can help us? Because a lot of times it's just being that information hub and being able to tell folks that need groceries, oh, hey, the food pantry over here on 3rd Street is still running their food pantry. So that's where we send folks. Or, hey, the First Baptist Church is doing a big clothes drive or whatever it may be. So again, having those relationships built in advance will help you through the disaster as if it's just a regular day. And then finally, we need to have a kingdom mindset. It ought to not be about, we want to grow numbers in the Alliance Church. We want to, be able to say we did X number of houses and, had this many contacts with people. But the real number is, how many people were we able to put in touch with Jesus Christ? Because that's the most important thing. If we are bringing people in touch with Jesus, I don't care if they go back to the Methodist church where they grew up, or they go to the Catholic church, or they go to wherever, as long as they are back in touch with Jesus, living their lives on fire for Christ, that ought to be our ultimate goal in the end. I feel like I've been talking a lot here, so we'll slow down just a little bit. A couple of cautions that we'll talk to you about. A lot of times, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, as they say, but we as Alliance, members of the Alliance Church, tend to a lot of times have a mindset of, well, that's the pastor's job, right? We always say that's the pastor's job. What we found out in the midst of a disaster, and when these disasters help, our pastors have huge hearts and they will help. And they will try to be everything for everyone. But then they're also going to develop what we call compassion fatigue. And we have found that if that pastor doesn't get the support they need, they don't get other team members coming alongside of them, within 2 years, they're working at the factory, they're back, working as a school teacher. They're somewhere other than in full-time ministry, and we want them to stay in ministry. So we need to remember that we hired our lead pastors to shepherd our church. We need to find other folks to come alongside him to be a part of this disaster team, to pick up that mantle and move forward with it and be able to work and do those types of things. As we're doing our ministries now in outreach ministry, are we making sure that those folks aren't going out alone and doing things? They need to have a partner. They need to be holding each other accountable. They need to be praying with each other. They need to be supporting each other and doing all of those things that Jesus taught us to do and taught his disciples to do. And the other thing I'll caution you about is to safeguard your Sabbath day. And I mean that not to say, your Sunday church service Sabbath day, but if you have a day when you say, hey, Thursday mornings is the day I go golfing, and that's just my time to unwind, or Thursday morning is the time that I spend just a little extra time in the Word, I spend a little extra time in prayer, whatever. Or, hey, Wednesday night is date night for my wife and I, or my spouse and I. Maintain that as much as you can. Obviously, the first few days, weeks following a disaster, it's going to be chaos, and you may not be able to do that. But as soon as you can get back to building a pattern of life that's normal, safeguard those Sabbath days. I think I said before, we have to be cautious that we don't become unhealthy ourselves, right? So we have to stay healthy. We have to maintain those Sabbath days. We absolutely have to stay grounded in Scripture. We have to stay bathed up to our necks in prayer. And we need to be able to have that time with our spouse, with our family, and just be able to be there and not be worried about what's going on next door. So I would encourage each of you to continue to safeguard your Sabbath time or your Sabbath day. One of the other things that we've seen is that teams come in, and if they stay too long, the folks in the community will start to build a relationship with that team. And then when they leave to go back to Ohio or California or wherever they come from, that's just a second loss for them. So what we want to encourage, and that's why we have the local team leaders. We want those relationships, that connection to be made back to the local church, back to someone in their community. So we kind of use a rule of thumb of teams of 5 to 7 people for no more than 5 to 7 days. That allows them to come in, they get to get a good week's work done, and then go home, and then the next group comes in. But as long as that team leader from the local church is staying consistent, that's where those relationships are being built. That's where that connection's being built. And it all leads back to the local church, which leads back to Jesus. I think I've said that once or twice already today. The other thing we need to be cautious of, and I think this relates into even for folks that are doing current outreach ministries, care and compassion can often be mistaken for romance. And I think that's probably one of the few things that Hollywood gets right is, you know, if you watch a disaster film, you know, something chaotic happens, 2 people are thrown together in the midst of chaos, they end up having sex, which gets converted into romance, which just never works out, right? And in fact, it usually expands the problem and creates more problems. So we have to be very cautious that we are not allowing our care and compassion to be mistaken for romance or for personal feelings. So again, that comes with going out as partners, being accountable, having someone there praying with you and being with you all the time. And then as we are looking outside the church, because that's what we want to do, we don't want to have everything inside the church, but we also need to remember that our church members are going to continue to have the same issues they had before this disaster strike. So if they were already having financial difficulties, if they were already having marital issues, they're going to continue to be having those issues. And in fact, they're probably exasperated by this disaster because folks are quarantined together now, and we get stressful, and you know those little fights become big fights and those things. So again, as pastors, we need to remember those things and make sure that we're not forgetting our sheep that we're there to shepherd and to continue to do those. On the same note, our children are much more resilient than we give them credit for. And I've heard so many well-intentioned people say, oh, well, we just don't want the kids to have to worry about that. We don't want the kid, you know. And I think we have to be age appropriate, but I think we need to be honest with our children. And I'll give you an example. And again, I'll go back to Houston because that was one of the bigger disasters that I had worked there. And we get into that process a couple months into it. And some of the kids that were, you know, middle school, high school age, just started, they were sloughing off school. They didn't care anymore. And as we got some crisis counselors in to talk to them, what we found out was because the parents hadn't talked to them, their process was, we had this disaster, we have to rebuild the house, so now there's no money for me to go to college, so why should I even bother caring about school anymore? So again, it comes down to just communicating with these kids, and maybe we have to be honest and say, you know what, we don't have the money for college, but maybe we can stay home and do a community college for a year, and then we'll be back to where we're at. But as we all know, if we let our imaginations run wild with us, we always go to the worst case scenario. And children are the same way. So let's be honest with our children. Again, age appropriate and all of that. But they are stronger than we think they are. and they deserve us to be upfront and honest with them. The other thing we find pretty consistently about that 2 to 3 month following a major disaster is when a lot of the psychological issues will start to pop up. At this time, things have started to come back to kind of the new normal. We're not spending every day cleaning out the house, mucking out the house, bouncing from hotel to relative's bed to wherever. We're starting to come back to normal. Then we start to realize, oh, I'm having these recurring dreams, and that's why I can't sleep. I'm still doing this or that. It's why I don't eat properly or whatever. And so those psychological issues then will start to pop up in about that 2 to 3 month period. So we have to start planning immediately for in about 2 to 3 months, we're going to need to make sure we have a team come in that can do some psychological first aid, that can do some crisis counseling, that can help take care of those things. And just as much for our local team members as for the folks in the community. So again, just know that that's one of those things that will happen, and we need to prepare in advance for that kind of a thing. And hopefully I haven't scared you off completely, but I'll just leave you this, we need to keep our faith in the Lord and be open to the moving of the Holy Spirit. I know that there have been times when I've walked away from a conversation or walked away from a situation, goes, man, why didn't I just say this or that? I really felt like the Spirit was telling me to say it, and I just didn't do it, right? We need to be open, and if the Holy Spirit speaks something into us, we need to have the courage to just speak it out and move with the blessing of the Spirit to be able to do that. And that's easy for me to sit here and say, not sometimes as easy to do, but just remember to keep moving forth and moving in the direction that the Holy Spirit's leading you to do. And I think I'm open for questions at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil. Yes, if anybody has any questions, feel free to start typing them in the chat. Phil, one of the things that's encouraging to me is just, and I'm starting to think about what it looks like for a disaster team. You can think about where are you reaching out now, and then expand upon that for what's that going to look like in a disaster. The hashtag, where are we reaching out now and building relationships so that if a disaster strikes, how can we just move that to a greater level depending on the need during a disaster. And that's something that we can think about now. It's not something that's we've got to get this disaster team prepared, a whole thing put together before we can think about it. No, it's step by step, something that we can do now and just start planning. So that's encouraging to me that it doesn't have to be a big thing all at once. So
no, if we start with just trying to get our folks that come to church on Sunday morning to look at that hashtag house and start looking at reaching out to our neighbors and how can we help our neighbors that a lot of us maybe haven't even met. We live in a house, we go off to work, we come home and we stay in our, we don't socialize with our neighbors as much as we used to years ago. Now it's, all about the kids and those things, but let's take time to get back to building those relationships with neighbors in the community and those things.
We did have a question earlier. The question was, during a disaster, how do we make the meeting of immediate needs an effective Christ-centered response?
Sure. So I think it's just being able to be there with folks. A lot of times meeting the immediate need is we're handing them a Walmart card, we're handing them a grocery store card, a fuel card. We're doing those immediate things to help them, or we're serving a meal. Where it becomes Christ-centered is that where they're doing it. I often get told, why would you come here from Ohio to do this for us? Or, why would teams from Oregon come to California to help us do this? That just opens the door to let us tell the story of, well, because as a Christian, I feel it's my responsibility to help my brothers and sisters, and to do those types of things. And I'll be honest, with all the different trainings and police and fire and things that I've done, one of the greatest accolades I ever got was from a young man that I had helped train, who told me I had been a calming influence in his life. So for us to be able to come into the midst of a disaster, into the midst of chaos, and bring the calm and peace of Jesus with us, that's how we make it a Christ-centered response.
Great.
I hope that answered their question.
Yeah, well, answered the question for me. So one of the other question, well, it was more of a statement, but it made me think. Someone said, as a church staff member, I feel a responsibility to be informed or equipped to respond to the needs of our community. I would assume that others feel out in our community feel that same way too. They want to figure out how they can serve. They want to, be able to stay up to date so they know how to serve the community. How would you say we can help our communities stay informed and know how to do that as well? Does that make sense?
Sure. I think some of just in some simple training, if you teach somebody how to do first aid and CPR, they're more confident in doing that. As a firefighter, I go out and I teach people how to use a fire extinguisher. Yeah, it's pretty simple. You can watch the cartoon and, you pull the whatever. But when you've actually done it, you just feel more confident that you can do that. So I think through training and just getting out there and keeping people informed. And I think as the church, we do a fairly poor job, or at least as pastors, we do a poor job of asking people to help us do things. And there are folks that are sitting out in the congregation that have a logistics background, that have a law enforcement or fire service background, that are waiting to help, but they're waiting for someone to ask them to help. So I think we just need to say, hey, we're looking at doing some disaster response, community outreach types of things. If you're interested, we want you, kind of the old Uncle Sam wants you type of thing. And just ask folks. We know the people in our congregation, so don't be afraid to go out and say, that's how I got into this. I got a call from our district superintendent who said, hey, Phil, your name came up and they said you might be good at this, this, and this. Would you be interested? And of course, that's how it works. So we just need to ask folks to pray about it and to help us.
Start building those relationships now through trainings or asking and whatnot, and it helps that whole cycle. Is that
absolutely? Yep, absolutely. It's all about relationships and building those bridges now with the fire department, the police department, the other community organizations, and those folks.
Great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think we're about out of time. I want to keep everybody on 1 hour here. So thank you both, Phil and Troy, for your time. Troy, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before I close us out?
I would just say to answer the question, what do we do? Just show up.
Amen.
Just be there, because you don't even have to say anything. Just your presence with the Spirit of God controlling you is going to bring what Phil mentioned is calm, and that's what people need. Just everything's okay.
Yeah. Those are great words for our time right now. Just through the pandemic, just being there, allowing people to share their stories, as Phil was saying, building those relationships, showing up like.
May I make one more comment? Sure. The idea of partnering. They're as afraid of you as you are of them. So just step into it.
Amen.
Amen. Just reach out and partner.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So just so everybody that's on the call knows, we've got a kind of a basis now, but Phil has also agreed to, at some point we're working towards an additional set of training. So to prepare for disasters. So, one of the hopes maybe that you can walk away with today, or your one step, is to think about what that leader is that could take things further if a disaster happens, to expand the ministry that you have. Maybe that can be your step for now. And then our office would like to provide additional training in areas we haven't worked out any of the details, but some of the things that Phil talked about, a building team dynamics and problem solving, disaster supplies, best practices, psychological first aid that he mentioned, knowing your communities, a variety of different topics like that. So if you're walking away with, hey, who's that person? Start thinking about that now, and in the months to come, as we can put on more training, you can bring that person along and to the next step for your team as well. So and as you also just want you to know that the Alliance Northwest is thinking about what it looks like for us, our office, to be able to help and walk alongside a church when something happens, to have someone like a Phil in our field to help when something happens with a church, or either just to that church or a disaster like the wildfires. Someone that we could help to resource the churches with different skill sets or finances or manpower, or some of these things that we've been talking about. So if you know someone in your church that has some of those things, feel free to let me know. We're talking through what that role looks like, and trying to just brainstorm what that would look like as far as a team or coordinator. So feel free to reach out and let me know. I think that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and I hope that you found it beneficial. And we just are grateful for all that you do for the kingdom. Thanks so much.